Well, they have to be in their 70s or something.
I know, and exactly. And I have got a bit of grey hair, but anyway, please don't use it because I'm not used to it
Believe
either.
me, I won't. Right, so Jeremy is here mainly because he's got a book out. It's called, and I'll brandish it in front of the camera for those of you that are watching, Can We Be Great Again? Why a Dangerous World Needs Britain. And there's a picture of a tortoise with a Union Jack shell. Now, I'm going to take issue with the title, because I think we've always been great and we still are great, but you clearly don't.
No, I do think we're a great country. I chose it because it was deliberately a provocative echo of what Donald Trump has been doing with MAGA. But the reason that I phrased it that way was another reason as well, which is that I think we're obsessed with our decline. And I don't think we are. Of course, we've declined compared to the days when we ran a quarter of the globe and, the days of the British Empire. But actually, the correct comparison is how influential we are compared to other countries today. And, I wrote this book because after being Foreign Secretary, I was convinced that we actually have a lot more influence than we think we have. And I wanted to get to the bottom of whether that was really true.
Is it?
It is. So
how do you quantify that, though?
Okay, so what I do in the book is I took the 8 biggest problems the world faces, from war in Europe to the future of democracy to the global migration crisis to climate change and so on. And then I looked objectively at what all the experts say about Britain's influence. And without any shadow of a doubt, of 193 countries in the United Nations, we are always in the top 10 most influential, often in the top 5. I mean, if you just look at in Europe alone, we have the top military, the top universities, the top technology sector, more soft power, more hard power than any other European country. And my argument is not that we don't have lots and lots of problems, because we really do at home and abroad. But in a very dangerous world, then I'm saying, come on, countries with influence have got to use it. And I'd say the same to a bunch of French people or Aussies or Americans or Germans. Like, look, this is not a time. That's why I have a tortoise on the front cover. It's not a time for retreating into our shell. Because of the English language, more people watch British TV than from any other country apart from America. That gives us incredible global influence. And at a time when people are arguing about democratic values, for goodness sake, let's get our mojo back.
Do you think it's partly because we've never been particularly brilliant at shouting about how good we are? I mean, in the sense, you just mentioned a whole raft of things there where we genuinely are world leading, but we never really shout about it in the way that the Americans do it unashamedly, and they're not embarrassed about it. The French, I think, are the same.
We are the world experts at washing our dirty linen in public.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember once...
But that's enough about the BBC.
I remember 3 years, I was going to give you a different example actually. Well, I remember 3 years after I was elected, you'll remember this very well, we had the MP expenses scandal. And, our MPs in the UK were the laughing stock all over the world. You've got a Home Secretary who charged a bath plug on expenses.
Oh, hang on a minute. Lay off my friend Jackie Smith.
No, but I'm just pointing, I wasn't going to mention her name because I didn't think that was fair to drag it up. But, we are very good at this. And we have a British modesty, but also I think we have a sense that we are a country that can shape the world as well as be shaped by it. At big moments in the world's history, we've done that. And for goodness sake, if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? I mean, we've got Putin waging war in Ukraine and possibly over to some of the other countries in Europe if we don't contain what he's doing there. We've got Xi Jinping saying that the future of the world is not democracy, it's autocracy. We've got a massive migration crisis. There is so much where I think a confident Britain could do more. And I say this, by the way, as no fan of the Labour government that we have. But I will say this, I think that when it comes to international diplomacy, Keir Starmer hasn't done a bad job. He has been able to walk this tightrope of getting on with Trump in the White House and VDL, Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels, and they both seem to quite like him. So, let's use that. This is a moment when Britain could could be shouting a bit more.
How much is it all based on personal relationships? I mean, you were foreign secretary, you had to meet foreign leaders, your foreign secretary counterparts all over the world, and there will have been some that you got on with and liked, and others that you possibly wouldn't want to spend too much time with at all. And I always remember that famous phrase that Margaret Thatcher came out with about Gorbachev, this is a man we can do business with. Well, not only did she do business, she clearly liked him. He liked her. They got on, even though they had furious rows. How much is it all based on personal relationships?
Well, it depends on the person. I'll tell you who it really is based on personal relationships with, and that is Donald Trump. And I met him a number of times when I was Foreign Secretary. And I thought he wouldn't, for example, be interested in me. I'm a lowly Foreign Secretary. I thought he would only focus on Theresa May. But no, the New York property developer was sizing up every single person in the room, figuring, what do they care about? Do I go in high? Do I go in low? And it was fascinating looking at him size up the people in a room. And I think with Donald Trump, he's so unpredictable that you have to take a lot of trouble over that relationship, because if you don't, 3 weeks' time, exactly 3 weeks, we will be in the middle of a NATO summit in Brussels. And I was round the table in 2018 at the NATO summit when Trump nearly pulled America out of NATO. He had that big argument with Angela Merkel. So, how you deal with an unpredictable America is one of the many problems.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that now, because it is the dilemma that every foreign leader has to face. And I was watching the television pictures today of the new German Chancellor in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, hoping he wasn't going to get the Zelensky treatment. And he looked distinctly uncomfortable. I couldn't hear what they were saying because I was recording a podcast. It's just on the screen. But if you don't... Keir Starmer's had a lot of criticism for effectively kowtowing to Donald Trump. But then I think, well, what was the alternative? Because I had Ed Davey on the programme last night. He's been very, very sort of quite vicious in his language about Trump. And I understand why. But I said, the fact is, Ed, if you had been Prime Minister now, we wouldn't have this trade deal. Now, you can decry the trade deal and say it's not very good, it doesn't cover a lot, but it's better than what we would have got otherwise. And with your attitude of basically angering him, that would not have happened. And he said, well, I don't think that's the case at all, but it clearly is, isn't it?
He is talking nonsense. And by the way, if Ed Davey was in government, he would be doing exactly what Keir Starmer is doing now. And let's be honest, the risk you have with Trump is that he says, I'm so fed up with these Europeans not spending money on defence. By the way, American taxpayers fund about a third of the cost of defending Europe. I mean, you may not agree with Trump, but on this one, he's bang to rights. And the big risk you have with someone who's prepared to take America out of the WTO, the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, he says, actually, I'm done with NATO. I want to focus on China. Thank you very much. And, I'll tell you, we wouldn't be arguing about 2.5% or 3% of GDP if that was the case. It would be whether we spend 5% or 8% of GDP. And so I think Keir Starmer is right to be very cautious about not inflaming Trump. But, this is where I wish he would show a bit more ballsiness, frankly. On defence, we're the biggest military power in Europe. Where Britain leads, others follow. If he said, I'm going to spend 3% of GDP on defence and I'm going to put the money aside for it, France and Germany would follow and we would basically solve this problem. But this cautiousness is meaning that we are heading for a showdown at the moment in this NATO summit, which is fraught with danger. I think, when David Cameron persuaded NATO to spend 2% of GDP back in 2014, the UK was one of only 3 countries in NATO that did that. Now 23 do. We're spending $400 billion more every year. That is, there's a moment where Britain can show a bit of global leadership and sort out these problems.
But what do you make of the fact that the Strategic Defence Review was published on Monday? On Tuesday, Mark Rutte says everyone needs to spend 3.5% by, 2034, 2035. And you think, well, what kind of joined-up government is that? When you say you have an ambition for 3%, the day before the NATO General Secretary says there needs to be a commitment to 3.5%, and then Trump comes up with 5%. So I don't understand how that can be allowed to happen, because they must have known that Mark Rutte was going to say this.
Yes, and I think that that's why the government is running away from what is admittedly a very difficult decision. By the way, you haven't asked me yet, but former Chancellor, you've got to be able to answer the question.
We'll get onto that.
How would you pay for it? And there is a very, straightforward answer. There's the only way actually that you can really afford this, and that is by doing something that would actually be very good for the economy as well, which is welfare reform. If we got the welfare bill down to the levels it was just 5 years ago in 2019 before the pandemic, for working age adults, that saves just under 50 billion quid a year. Something's gone very badly wrong. It's costing about 11% of GDP when you include pensions. And, we're paying people not to work. And we need to get people back into work. It's good for the economy. It's also good for the individuals involved. And so, if I have a worry about all this noise about U-turns on winter fuel, U-turns on the 2-child cap, it's that it looks like a government that's scared of biting the bullet in the single biggest area of government expenditure, which is running out of control.
Before we go to a break, of all of the different jobs you held in government, the 3 major ones, Health, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor, but you're also Culture Secretary, which of those did you enjoy most?
There is no question. If it's enjoyment, there is no better job in the world than being Foreign Secretary, because you go all over the world, red carpets, motorcycle outriders, meet fascinating people, and none of the problems you're talking about are your fault. So, if you said which job had the most emotional punch, which job, do I still inside me more than any other, it's probably being Health Secretary, because you're dealing with these life and death decisions every day. And then if you said which job had the most power, that is definitely Chancellor. But as Rachel Reeves is finding out, with power comes responsibility and a lot of pressure.
After the 2019 leadership election against Boris Johnson, I've read that he offered you the chance to be Defence Secretary and you turned it down. Is that true?
It is. It is.
Do you regret that now? Because you would have been Defence Secretary at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. An immensely important role to hold.
I have to say that Ben Wallace, who took the job, was an exceptional Defence Secretary. So in terms of the country, I think we did very well with the way it ended up. It was a difficult moment for me. There was a leadership contest. I come second. All the conventions were in that situation. Previous winners would have kept me on as Foreign Secretary, and in the Westminster world, it was a demotion. And I was worried that if that was the way Boris wanted to treat me at that moment, then it might reflect some bigger fault lines in our relationship. And so that's why I didn't feel that I wanted to do it. And also I've been in the cabinet nearly a decade, so I was absolutely knackered.
But looking back, do you wish you had taken a different decision?
No, because looking back, for whatever reasons in the twists and turns of fate, I ended up as Chancellor, and that was utterly fascinating. And by the way, when it comes to defence, what's the decision I'm most proud of? Well, perhaps giving the economy a soft landing after 11% inflation and getting it down to 2%, but also defence spending up to 2.5%. That was a big thing.
Right, more from Jeremy Hunt in a moment, and he'll also be taking your calls. We've got quite a few lined up already. If you'd like to ask him a question, 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
19 minutes past 8 on LBC. Lots of questions coming in. I'm not going to ask you about Israel Gaza because there'll be a couple of questions on that. But we started talking about your time as Chancellor. And by the way, if you just tuned in, we're talking to Jeremy Hunt. He's written this new book called Can We Be Great Again? Let's look at some of the decisions that you were faced with. I suppose the first one was whether to take the job or not, because it was after that disastrous mini-budget. Kwasi Kwarteng was sacked and Liz Truss needed somebody to come in. And I guess at that point, the point that you took the job, you were probably the most powerful Chancellor in recent history, because there was no way that she could have got rid of you, whatever you wanted to do.
I must admit, I didn't really think that at the time. I thought it in retrospect. And there is a sort of irony in the guy who, as you know, tried to become leader of the party and prime minister 3 times and failed 3 times, suddenly ending up in this very, very powerful position, perhaps more powerful than the prime minister. But we had a crisis, markets collapsing around our ears. And what was kind of comical and very kind of British in a way was that when I originally got this text from, on my phone, when I was with my wife on a holiday in a weekend away in Brussels, actually. And I got this message saying, Liz Truss here, please call. And I thought, it's got to be a hoax. So I ignored it. And then the phone rang and it was an unrecognised number. It was actually the number 10 switchboard, but I didn't recognise the number, so I zapped it. I didn't take the call, and we went down and had breakfast. I said, I can't believe these idiots think I'm so naive that I'll believe it was actually Liz Truss trying to call me. And eventually, a friend of mine called me and said, number 10 really is trying to get in touch with you. And so very gingerly, I called the number 10 switchboard, and because I said, look, I think it's probably a hoax, but I got a message the Prime Minister wants to call to speak to me. And they said, oh, no, she does. And finally I got through. And it was a scary period. And I know it's fashionable to criticise Liz Truss, but I will say that she had a lot of courage. I had to undo all the decisions she'd taken in the mini-budget and all the decisions she campaigned on to become Conservative leader and Prime Minister. And she didn't have any quibbles. She just let me get on with doing what I needed to do. And in that 1 week I was working with her, I thought that was gutsy.
Were you confident in your own ability to do the job? Because, you had a lot of experience in government, but you'd never held an economic portfolio. And self-knowledge it's very important in these situations, isn't it? And I know that anything to do with economics, I would be absolutely useless at. Were you totally confident in your ability?
It's such a great question. I remember in the Conservative leadership contest, you were hosting the hustings between me and Boris Johnson. And in one of them, you said to me, do you ever get imposter syndrome? And
something I didn't bother asking Boris because I knew what the answer would be.
and in a rather sort of blasé way, I brushed it away. I said, of course I can do this job. You have to say that in that situation. Yeah. You can't express doubt. And I didn't really have doubt, actually. But I thought about it afterwards. And I thought, surely you must have some self-doubt. I think the truth is that that particular situation after the mini-budget, when we had this carnage in the markets, it was easy in one particular way, which is that, I hadn't created the problems and I had carte blanche to do what it took to get us out of the mess.
And did she say that to you directly?
She did.
You do what you have to do.
She absolutely. And she said it, and she was true to her word. And so, in a way, it was very easy working with the civil servants because we just had to, and they're brilliant civil servants, Treasury civil servants, an amazing group of people. We just had to work out what it was that needed to be done. If there was a hairy moment, I was appointed on a Friday afternoon, and I went in to see the Treasury officials, and it was early Friday evening, and we worked till probably 11 o'clock. But we were nowhere near a solution, and I had to do a media round on the Saturday morning because I just had to calm the markets and calm everyone down. And I didn't know what our solution was going to be. I knew I had the weekend to get there. That was quite a challenging time to answer questions. But as I say, fantastic Treasury officials, and we got there.
You could have been one of the shortest serving chancellors in history. Rishi Sunak kept you on. How did those discussions go?
Well, I think that was very decent of Rishi, because he didn't owe me. I mean, I had supported him in the leadership contest, but I think he felt that I'd calmed the markets and we didn't want any more change at that stage. But you're right, when Liz Truss offered me the job, and I do talk about this in the book, I thought do I want to do this because it's going to be so short? And I accepted it for this, in retrospect, rather trivial reason, which is I was chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, and I knew that we never train enough doctors in the NHS. We always have these doctor and nurse shortages. And I wanted to double the number of training places. And the Treasury had been blocking it when I was Health Secretary and after I stopped being Health Secretary. And I thought, if I'm any chance of like a couple of weeks and I can at least get the number of bloody doctors trained up, it won't be a waste of time. And so that was kind of part of my motivation.
And did you use the job to sort of do a few things that were sort of pet things for you?
I took the view that we were probably unlikely to win the next election. So the only thing to focus on are things that would outlast me, decisions that would stand the test of time. And I did. When it came to the NHS, I gave the NHS £3.5 billion to completely overhaul their IT systems, which are creaking. It's going to take a while for us all to feel the benefit of that, but that was much overdue. Defence spending we've talked about. I did something to support the theatre industry, having been Culture Secretary. There were quite a few things when you've been in the cabinet a while that you want to do. But there were also things that I didn't get round to doing where I would have liked to have gone further. I still think power is ridiculously centralised in London in this country.
But isn't that, the question that you ask on the cover of your book, can we be great again? There are many people who think the Treasury is the block to us being great again because they block innovation. They don't sort of, the default answer usually is no. Does the Treasury need to be completely reformed if Britain is really to motor ahead in the way that you clearly think it can?
Well, I think actually Treasury officials are okay on this. They certainly weren't when I was there, but it needs a lot of political will. But look, it's ridiculous. For example, this week Rachel Reeves announced £15 billion of transport infrastructure for the north, and I don't object to that decision at all. But we must be the only country in the Western world where a city the size of Manchester has to bang on a door in London to get the money it wants to upgrade its train system. Can I just say one thing on the economy, though, Ian? We all full of stories of doom and gloom on the economy, and Rachel Reeves has difficult decisions like I did. But the Centre for Economics and Business Research, a very respected consultancy, they say we are the 6th largest economy in the world today, and in 15 years' time, we will still be the 6th largest economy in the world. And in fact, in that period, we'll close the gap a bit with Germany and Japan, who are higher than us on the list, and we'll pull a bit further ahead of France. And so I think there is a perception that we're just going to hell in a handcart economically. It has been very, very tough. But I think what we forget sometimes is that other countries have been going through a difficult period too. And we've got to pull our finger out. We've got to make these big changes. But
do you think also the media is a bit of a block here? That bad news is news, good news is advertising. So if the OECD or the IMF downgrade Britain's growth, that's headline news. It's less headline news when they upgrade Britain's economic growth. You've just said about this report. I don't know when that came out. I haven't heard about it. And I'm thinking, well, why haven't I heard about it? Because, I like to talk up Britain's prospects. I hate this sort of sense of, it's it is a little bit like the mid 1970s, where there was this general view, and I think Jimmy Carter was accused of this in America, of this national malaise. And we've got to get ourselves out of this mindset.
I couldn't agree with you more. And look, of course, the media is partly responsible, but that's because it's a free press, and most people in the media rightly think their job is to hold politicians to account and not to trumpet how brilliant they are. And I think we're all very happy that we live in a country where that is the case. But I think it's also important just to get perspective. And, the truth is, when you've got really big problems out there, there's a handful of countries that could help solve them. I'll just give you one example. We've got to stop the small boats. There is a global migration crisis. Who is the country that wrote most of the international law that makes it difficult to stop people getting here and difficult to deport them when they do? It was us. We wrote it in the 1940s, someone called David Maxwell Fyfe, which is the country right now that happens to be led by a human rights lawyer who's Prime Minister. It's Britain. It's Sir Keir Starmer. He knows the European Convention on Human Rights like the back of his hand. The world is crying out for someone to rip up this international law and rewrite it for a modern age. And he could do that. And not an easy task, but, other countries face exactly the same problem. I think they would welcome something like this.
Kemi Badenoch tomorrow is going to make a speech where she says she's going to launch a review of the ECHR. And a lot of Conservatives will hope that ends in the conclusion we should come out of it. There are other Conservatives, and these are not all on the left of the Conservative Party by any means, who would find that quite a difficult decision to stomach.
Well, it wouldn't be the optimal decision to leave. But if we had to, and there was no other solution, I would support it, because in the end, elected politicians have to persuade voters that we have control of the borders. But the problem is that you can never ultimately stop the boats coming across the channel unless you stop them coming across the Med first. And so actually you do need to have a change in the international laws that govern these things. That's the proper solution. So I would favour having a crack at that first. But, in the end, we have to have control of our borders.
Right, we will talk more for the next half an hour, but it's you. You're going to be asking the questions. I don't mean you, Jeremy, obviously, but our listeners are going to ask the questions. So if you'd like to ask Jeremy Hunt a question on his new book, or indeed anything else, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31, news headlines on LBC with Matt Hewitt.
Nigel Farage says he's genuinely sorry his party chairman's resigned. Zia Youssef has quit Reform, saying he no longer believes working to get them elected is a good use of his time. A judge has described a 15-year-old boy's behaviour as wicked, jailing him for 7 years for the manslaughter of an 80-year-old dog walker in Leicester. Bim Coley was filmed being kicked, punched and racially abused. And Donald Trump's threatened to take away Elon Musk's government contracts as the row between the US president and the world's richest man deepens. It's after the Tesla owner criticised Mr. Trump's tax and spending plans as big and ugly. LBC weather, a few showers tonight for most of the UK, rain moving into the west later, lows of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
8:34. Jeremy Hunt is with us. Can we make Britain great again? Did you debate that as a title? Because
no, it would have been a bit long.
Yeah.
But,
Can we be great again is the title of his new book. Anthony is in Ashford. Anthony, very good evening. What would you like to say?
Yes. Well, good evening, Ian, and good evening to Jeremy.
Hi, Anthony.
Hi. My question is, how do you think Keir Starmer is doing with Trump in the light of what's going on this evening? You know, the fire and fury going on there. Do you think he did the right thing by taking the invite and by steering a pretty steady course with Trump?
I suspect you don't know what's gone on this evening.
I don't actually. Yeah, tell me more.
He's had the most massive fallout, which I did predict on the 20th of January with Elon Musk, and he's threatening to cancel all of Musk's contracts with the US government and goodness knows what else.
Right. Okay. Well, good example of why actually I think Keir Starmer's done a good job with Trump, because this is a very, very unpredictable man. And, I think that Keir Starmer does seem to come across as someone who has a relatively low ego compared to many world leaders. And, it's a tightrope dealing with someone like Donald Trump. And, the fact that we're not, paying the tariffs that the EU and China and other trading partners are paying is obviously a very good thing. It's a Brexit benefit, which I suspect that Keir Starmer doesn't like to think about too much. But look, I think he hasn't done badly when it comes to the international stage. I profoundly disagree with a lot of the decisions he's made at home. I think cancelling the Rwanda scheme is something that he will really come to regret now that
I would have thought you wouldn't have been comfortable with that.
No, I think that you've got to have something that deters people from making these journeys. And, the cost of housing people coming across the channel is absolutely unbelievable. And so I think he's made mistakes there, don't get me wrong. But I think he is being very wise to avoid the fireworks, avoid the grandstanding. What do you think, Anthony?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that some people were predicting the special relationship was in effect dead before Starmer went over there, but certainly it wasn't, and he played that kind of blinder with the invite. I think that had a big effect on Trump. I just don't think Trump wants to destroy his relationship with Britain. He's got too many emotional ties. I think that plays a big role in it.
Yes, and he seems to have a big soft spot for the royal family, and full marks to King Charles, but also to the late Queen, who I remember when I was Foreign Secretary, the main reason he came for a state visit was because he wanted to have tea with the Queen. And I guess we all like to have tea with the Queen, but full marks to her for being up for it.
Anthony, thank you for that. Just a little bit more on Donald Trump and Elon Musk. This is what Elon Musk has just tweeted. Time to drop the really big bomb. Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That's the real reason they've not been made public. Have a nice day, DJT. I think we need to get Simon Marks back on after 9 o'clock, Chris, because, that is some allegation, isn't it? But he survived worse.
Yes, I was just thinking 3 letters, OMG.
I was thinking 4, but anyway. Anthony, thank you. Let's go to Steve in Petworth. Hello, Steve.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm a bit in shock as to what I just heard as well. Never mind. On to my question. So, Jeremy, I've always admired you as a politician. Polished, stable performance I've written down here, and I do wish that you had won the Conservative election against Boris. And with that in mind, had you won, in what direction would you have taken the party?
Well, Steve, thank you for the generous sentiments. I want to be really honest with you. I think that if I had won...
Sound like Simon Cowell there.
Yeah, and if I had won and, Iain was there in a crucial part of that contest, I think there are some things I'd have done better than Boris and some things I'd have done worse. I think to his credit, Boris cut through all the Brexit issues and I voted Remain, and I think that it would have been... I could have presented exactly the same deal that Boris presented, and lots of Leave voters would have said that's not really Brexit because this guy voted Remain. And Boris was able to persuade his own tribe that, he was delivering on Brexit. So I think he deserves credit because, we were in such a mess over Brexit in the middle of 2019. And, I actually think it is a brilliant thing that at the last election we didn't talk about it, because boy, do we need to move on from that. And I think, by the way, we can make a great success outside the EU. It's up to us, to do what we need to do.
I remember in 2017, you told me at the Conservative Party conference that you'd voted Remain, but were there another referendum, and that was a big debate at the time, whether there should be, you would vote Leave. And I thought that was a refreshingly honest thing to do, because Theresa May, the next week, when I interviewed her, she was sitting in that chair, she refused to answer that question, and I think lived to regret it.
Well, I think it does give us a nimbleness.
That was my killer question. I said, well, if Jeremy Hunt can say this at the conference, Prime Minister, why can't you? And the look on her face.
Yes, I probably wasn't her most popular cabinet minister at that point. But to answer your question, Steve, I think probably, I like to think anyway, I might have made some different decisions in the pandemic, having been health secretary for 6 years, and that would have been a more natural territory for me than maybe it was for Boris. But who knows? He did do the vaccines and he did them very well.
In terms of what, though? What would you have done different? Lockdowns?
I felt that we were ignoring in the very early stages of the pandemic the incredible success that Korea and Taiwan were having with their test and trace program. Those countries actually didn't have a lockdown in the first year of the pandemic because they were so quick at isolating people who had the virus.
But didn't they already have the experience of that from previous outbreaks of different sorts of coronavirus?
They did, and that's why they, from the MERS virus in 2014-15, but I thought we should have been looking at them, and we didn't seem to. We sort of looked at China and we thought we can't copy them because it's a communist country, etc., etc. Fair enough, but Taiwan and Korea are both democracies, so I thought we didn't get that right in the early stages.
Wasn't there a practice run while you were health secretary on this?
There was.
And you got a lot of criticism for not really accepting some of the recommendations from that.
I don't think that was it. What I remember most vividly was that I was asked at one point to shut down all the life support machines in every intensive care unit in the country. This was a practice exercise, I have to say, Steve. This is not what. It's
pretty alarming one.
Yeah, this is not what health secretaries are routinely. This is practicing for what was happening, what you do if a pandemic got kind of out of control. And I said that is a ridiculous thing to ask a human being to do, and I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to do that, and stop the exercise. And I did get a bit of criticism from that because I think everyone thought,
But what was the logic of doing that?
The logic was that every person in intensive care requires one full-time nurse to look after them, and that those nurses would save more lives if they were released to go out into the community.
That's just
and
incredible.
So therefore, please turn off the plug for 4,000 people. That was the...
you become a mass murderer overnight.
I know, and I'm afraid I said no.
Well, I don't think anybody's going to criticise you for that. Steve, thank you very much. Let's move on to another Steve in Manchester. Hi, Steve.
Hi, good evening, Jeremy.
Hi, Steve.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you very much.
Forgive me, but I'm not massively big on titles either, so it'll be good for me. Jeremy, I'm a lifelong...
Oh, Steve, we're going to get you back on a different line because it keeps cutting out. I promise you we will get you back on, though. Mike's from Salisbury says, Jeremy's just said something quite significant about his time in number 11, about things that would outlast his term. How does he think we can get beyond such short-term thinking in our politics?
Mike, that is a brilliant question. And I'm not just saying that to buy time, which is normally what it means when a politician says it's a brilliant question. But why does that matter? Because Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, if you spoke to them, they would say democracies are doomed because they're incapable of taking long-term decisions. Only our system allows long-term decisions to be taken. I profoundly disagree with that. But we have got to be better at taking long-term decisions. And I think that there are some interesting examples. I mean, there's been a consensus across the political parties for 25 years that we need to take climate change seriously. And, some people will disagree with this, but we've actually decarbonised by more than any other big economy. And so we can do long-term decisions. But, in my book, actually, the final pages are a letter to Keir Starmer. And what I say is the real thing that I conclude is you're always told when you're Chancellor or Prime Minister, there's a trade-off. Do you spend money on defence? Do you spend money on the NHS? Do you have tax cuts? The only real trade-off is between the short term and the long term. And the difference between a good government and a bad government is good governments find a way to rise above the firefighting and take decisions for the long term. And, we can do that. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, your book, Iain, which I'm much looking forward to reading, but your book on Margaret Thatcher, there was a Prime Minister who was focused on making big changes for the long term. I can think of examples, even in recent times when we've taken decisions for the long term. But we've got to do it better. You're absolutely right.
Right, we're going to come back to Steve in Manchester in just a few moments' time. It's 8:45.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Right, let's go back to January of last year. We're in Bournemouth Town Centre. You'll hear former police officer Lorne Castle attempt to and then successfully arrest a 15-year-old.
Right! Stop resisting or I'm going to smash you, do you understand?
Now, this made for a lot of discussion, so let's get the former police officer.
The type of knife he had, it takes a very, very small movement to create an injury. Just short of 7 centimetres one end, and it's a Stanley blade the other.
That's going to do a lot of damage.
My intention was to prevent any movement. How much movement would it have taken if that knife had come out and just sliced along my body?
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, and the new LBC app. Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:48 on LBC. Jeremy Hunt is here. Can We Be Great Again is the title of his book. Steve is back on a better line in Manchester. Hello, Steve.
Iain, thank you for coming back to me.
Hi, Steve. Jeremy here.
Hey, Jeremy. Here's my question, or with a statement first and then a question. So I am a lifelong Labour voter. But that notwithstanding, I believe you have one of the finest political minds of our generation.
Wow, that's very nice of you. Thank you. I'm going to take that compliment. We don't get very many in politics, so thank you very much.
The bad timing, isn't it? Because you could have stuck it on the cover of your book. Anyway, here's my question. Are you going to stay with the failing Conservative Party, which will undoubtedly rebirth in some time, but for now they're a failing Conservative Party. Are you going to stay with the Conservative Party, or are you going to use your talent and your intellect for the better good? And I'm going to help you out here and give you some options, because I'm thinking United Nations, I'm thinking about NATO, I'm thinking about any one of half a dozen global NGOs.
Well, first of all, genuinely, Steve, thank you for the lovely comments, because we really don't get very much of it in politics. And so I really do appreciate that. Look, I do think that politics needs to have strong opposition parties as well as strong governments. And I want to help my party get back on its feet. And you're right, we're in the doldrums at the moment. But I think now, by the way, I don't think changing the leader is the answer. We've had 4 leaders in 4 years. I don't think we'd have any credibility if we did that. But I think we've got to move on from contrition, which is what we've kind of had for the last year, to ideas and solutions, because I think people want to hear opposition parties come up with solutions to the big problems that we face. And that's the next stage. And I think when we do that, we will start to do better than we're doing at the moment. And I actually think, Labour voters, Lib Dem voters, Reform voters, they actually need the Conservative Party to be getting out there. And actually, I think it's the economy that's the area where, basically we need to be making some arguments as to some big things we can do to get the economy growing. But thank you for your lovely comment.
Do you think that the Conservative Party is in an existential crisis?
I don't. I think that we're a very old political party, and we've got a very, very strong survival instinct. And, we're going to be around for many, many years, but you can't take anything for granted. And, what we need to be doing is arguing for the solutions that are going to make the lives of ordinary voters better. And, we've had a period of quiet. I think now we've got to start saying what we would actually do.
Richard says, why did you completely ignore the Cyprus issue when you were Foreign Secretary?
I didn't ignore it, but it wasn't clear to me that there was anything big that I would have been able to do. The people that you're dealing with on these issues, it's actually a parallel to the crisis in Gaza at the moment. I'm sure that David Lammy is as concerned as we all are about what is happening in Gaza. But the reality is that Netanyahu doesn't listen to Keir Starmer, but he doesn't listen to Trump. He didn't listen to Biden. And you have to be honest about the limits and the extent of your influence sometimes. And I didn't feel in that particular situation that we had influence that was going to get a result.
This is from John in Sherborne, who says, please ask Jeremy Hunt to comment on how to fix the anger in the UK, the lack of respect, the Labour policy to dumb down all the recognised traditions of the UK. Well, there's a lot there, but let's start with the anger, because you see it all the time on social media, don't you? Maybe it was always there and it's just social media that's brought it to the fore. I don't know. But what do you do about that?
I think that is part of the problem, actually, that we are still getting used to a social media world, and people, when they are writing anonymously, or even when they're not writing anonymously, but it's just a message, use much more extreme language, and that gets much more attention on social media. And I think that is a very big shame, and I think we need to row back from that, actually. And so how do we deal with it? That's a difficult question, because it's a free society, and politicians should never seek to control how people express themselves. But what I would say is that the way we're going to solve problems is by engaging in dialogue. It's not by losing our tempers. And I hope that's something that we can relearn in British politics.
Chris from Richmond was going to ask a question, but he can't now for some reason, so I'm going to ask it for him. He says, how far would you go in your criticism of Israel, and would you make the criticism in public or private? And obviously a reference to what David Lammy did a couple of weeks ago.
So David Lammy's dilemma, and I had the same dilemma as Foreign Secretary, is that if you criticise another country in public, you can sometimes lose access. Netanyahu can just say, well, that's fine, but don't expect to see me next time you come to Israel. and then you lose all your influence. And the world masters at this, by the way, Chris, are the Chinese, because they say, if you criticize us publicly, don't expect to meet us. And so it's a really difficult dilemma for a foreign secretary. I'm not foreign secretary now, so I can say that, some of those scenes I've seen on TV are absolutely appalling. And we should be allowing aid to go through. And I am very concerned. And I think that Israel is making life very difficult for lifelong supporters of Israel, of whom I've always considered myself to be one.
Billy is in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. Billy, hi. Go ahead.
Hi, evening, Iain, and good evening, Jeremy. It's nice to speak to you. I want to know if you stand by your decision to effectively make it illegal to strike in this country.
In what way?
Well, the right to strike, he was under David Cameron's leadership, in which you were a minister. The rules were tightened so that it was a minimum of 50%. And then in 2023, when you was Chancellor of the Exchequer, you introduced the minimum service level requirements, which heavily restricts the ability for people to strike. And if they do, they can be fired. So I just want to know if you still stand under that decision, given your book and its title.
Well, I'm not a big fan of public sector strikes. I'll be completely honest with you, Billy. I don't think those minimum service obligations ever actually got implemented. There was a lot of discussion as to whether we should. But, I was the health secretary who had the junior doctors on strike for a year. And, I became very concerned. I sense you're not going to agree with me on this one, but let me just say, the junior doctors, when they were striking last year when I was Chancellor, they said that they would not accept an offer in England that they had accepted in Scotland because England had a Tory government. And, I think that was political. That wasn't about, salary and terms in the NHS. And I do think that's wrong.
I understand what you're saying, but I think if you look at what the Labour Party did when they came into government, they effectively stopped the strikes by saying that they'd get round the table. Do you not think that the fact that was impossible, or at least the Tories didn't agree to get round the table, is at least something that, on reflection, you could look at and go, well, maybe we weren't so great at negotiating? Because, you could have dealt with the problem straight away. Keir Starmer, as you've highlighted.
Anyone can negotiate if you just give away to the demands, can't they?
Well, they can, but I think the key is the Labour Party haven't necessarily given way to the demands. They haven't immediately bowed down to all of the requests, but what they have been willing to do is to get round the table and talk. I seem to remember that the junior doctors wanted to get round the table, which Jeremy quite rightly highlights. And I'm not saying, it's perfect the way they dealt with it, but the Tories, under the leadership in which Jeremy Hunt was a minister, I'd argue weren't willing to get round the table and talk. They refused to, I seem to remember.
Quite the opposite. We were always willing to talk, but what we weren't willing to do is what Labour did, which is to slap £9.4 billion on the table. That's actually equivalent to 1 pence on income tax for every person who pays tax in the country. And so you can have this money without any productivity improvements. And I think that was a very big mistake. And I'm afraid what's happening now, as we're seeing with the junior doctors this year, is they're coming back and they're saying we're going to go on strike again. So, I'm not saying we got everything right, Billy, but I think on that particular one, the government got it wrong.
Thank you very much. A quick one from David in Aylesbury. We're running out of time, David, so very quick, please.
Sure. So, good to speak to you, Jeremy.
Hi, David.
Hi there. So, well done for all your hard work over the years. All the question is I can't work out how come we come out with these really strange outcomes in the leadership elections. And I just wondered, people like James Cleverly, Penny Mordaunt, yourself, sort of decent votes don't seem to get in. But it's partly, I think, because how the system works. So the Parliamentary Conservative Party kind of strategically try and manipulate so that there's a poor choice by accident for the members. I just wondered how you thought we could improve that process.
Well, I think it's a good question. And I have come to the conclusion that when a party is in power and they change its leader, I think it would be better if that decision was taken by the MPs in Parliament rather than by a a bunch of 160,000 party members who are suddenly literally deciding who the next prime minister is going to be, without necessarily any democratic mandate. That's a big area for reform. I think both the parties might want to reflect on whether the system we have serves the country the best. But that's a personal view, and I think people might listen to that and say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he lost under that system. So you're very welcome to discard it completely, but that is a view I've come to.
How often have you wondered over the years, well, if things had turned out differently?
Do you know what? I think my family would say that I've been a whole lot happier because I didn't become Prime Minister. And that's one of the sad, I don't want to end on a sad note, but I'll just say this. One of the sad things about this country is, can you think of any prime ministers in our lifetime for whom it hasn't, in one way or another, ended in tears? And that's quite sad, isn't it?
Stanley Baldwin, I think, is the most recent one, and that was nearly 100 years ago.
Yeah, sad, isn't it?
Well, that is a sad way to end the hour.
But there's a great book to cheer you up. Can we be great again? And we can be a great country.
I thought you were going to say Margaret Thatcher by Iain Dale.
Margaret Thatcher by Iain Dale is another great book because it tells you about a wonderful leader who really did make us great.
And we share the same publisher, so what's not to like?
Exactly.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for coming in. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Now, in the next hour, we're going to, we are going to get more on this developing spat between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. It really has gone nuclear this evening. But we are also going to talk about the fact that the family of an 80-year-old dog walker who was beaten to death have reacted with fury over his teenage killer's sentencing. A 15-year-old boy was ordered to serve just 7 years in a young offenders detention centre, and a 13-year-old girl was spared being jailed and instead handed a 3-year youth rehabilitation order. Why is it that we seem to treat teenagers much more leniently when they indulge in this kind of offence, and they're even granted anonymity? Can that really be right?
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the chairman of Reform UK has resigned after he described calls